So hello everybody. We'll probably have a couple people trickle in, but they're late, so that's their fault. Welcome to Open Data Leaders. I see a lot of new faces, so I'm going to do a little run through of kind of what we are, who the Center for Data Innovation is, what we get out of these, and introduce Daniel. So my name is Joshua New. I'm a policy analyst with the Center for Data Innovation. I believe you all met Henry coming up the elevator. He is our intern at the Center for Data Innovation. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank studying the intersection of data technology and public policy. That's our boilerplate. So open data is one of our biggest issues. We also focus on the Internet of Things, precision medicine, education data, artificial intelligence. Basically, if it's a buzzword, I realized it's in our job description. But so we run Open Data Leaders. They're traditionally monthly events. We kind of took a summer vacation. So we realized that there's so many interesting things going on in the federal and state governments with people carrying out interesting open data projects. But the people who use this data, the contractors, the general public, the journalists, the civil society groups, really have very, very few channels of communication to interact with people who are actually responsible for making this data available. And so we wanted to be one of those channels of communication. So we've had a lot of really interesting speakers. We've had the data.gov team kicking off. We've had a really awesome presentation from NOAA talking about their big data partnership before. It's really public information, if anyone were here for that, which is really cool. We've had NASA, we've had EPA, we've had USAID, so many people that I forget. And we're very excited to have Daniel Morgan this time. If you haven't heard him speak before, he's great. I had the misfortune of speaking at the same event at him once and it got completely overshadowed. So Daniel will just be giving basically a pretty top-level overview of what the Department of Transportation is doing with open data, how it's responding to the increase of more, how it's becoming more data-driven. Talk about some interesting projects. So it'll be about half an hour of official presentation and then half an hour of audience Q&A. Very informal. If Daniel wants to take questions during, he's allowed to. We give him that power. We could run microphones if we need it. I don't think we will. I like to keep it intimate and we can have a conversation kind of style. These will be recorded and they will go on our website or on the meetup group. I'll post a comment. Should be within a week. But before we get started, just a couple housekeeping things. There's a big old fishbowl back there. If you're interested in signing up for our newsletter where we announce events like this, we put out a lot of interesting data news that I write every Sunday morning, and our new articles and white papers that we put out. Feel free to leave your business card. Feel free to take one of mine. And then we are also always looking for connections in other federal agencies, people like Daniel, people working on other interesting open data projects. You can just give me their name and I'll harass them. I won't even mention you, but just please, if you have any questions, that'd be super helpful. And then also just a survey of the room, since there are so many new faces. Who's here for the first time? Well, awesome. Sweet. And so who here is from government, from federal or state agency? Okay, and who here is a contractor? Who here is just interested in open data? Cool. Who here is a journalist? Did you get any journalists? Okay. This was written up, though, in Morning Transportation the other day, though, so that's very exciting. So I will let Daniel take it away. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be in the back. And enjoy. Thanks so much for coming.
So I was going through the things that I'm competing with tonight. So who's a Patriots fan or a Steelers fan? Wow.
No.
I'll be fast. You can get out of here and watch the game if you want. Grocery Beck's around the corner. They might have TVs. So there may be drinks afterwards, and we'll try to placate you that way. If anybody abandoning their children for back to school night or anything like that? I'm probably not that cool. So there's a bunch of stuff going on. I want to set the stage a little bit about what the Department of Transportation is. Every federal agency is a little bit different, and I want to give some perspective about us. So I'll talk a little bit about the oversimplified version of the department's mission. So the first thing is we're an investor. Who spends the most money at the Department of Transportation? It's not the FAA, it's the Federal Highway Administration. We give about $40 billion a year to the states to maintain and build your roads. Keep them safe and all that good stuff. In airports, we put about $3 billion a year into airport improvements. We spend about $3 billion a year on top of that modernizing the air traffic control system. Transit, $10 billion a year to buy buses, to build new lines, to add capacity and all that kind of stuff. A lot of grant making, essentially. There's a lot of, here's the money, here's some oversight, and we get a lot of data in return, but it's not real-time data. The operation of your roads, your bridges, your transit systems is the responsibility of the states and the transit agencies. They're the ones with the really cool data. I get a lot of summary stuff. So there's big data, but the big data explosion isn't necessarily happening at my agency. And that's an important piece to understand as we think through sort of what the transportation ecosystem is going to evolve into as we grow. We also spend about $1 billion a year in research. Anything from alternative fuels for airplanes to interesting ways to detect and prevent wind shear, to interesting ways to build pavement and reduce the greenhouse emissions that are created when we actually lay concrete. When it cures, it breathes and makes emissions. I didn't know this. This is fun. We got all sorts of really cool stuff. That's all grant making money. We only operate 2 pieces of the transportation system: the airspace and the St. Lawrence Seaway, in partnership with Canada. That's it. Everything else is at the states, at the locals, and all that kind of stuff. So the real-time data, the cool stuff, the stuff that moves fast, is really from the FAA, and you'll get your St. Lawrence Seaway data from Canada because they have more locks than we do. There's like 12 locks in the system, or 16, and the US is responsible for 3, Canada's responsible for the rest. It's kind of fun. We're a regulator. So who has been affected by a car recall? That's us. 5-star safety ratings? That's us. DOT numbers on the side of trucks? That's us. Right? And there's a lot of interesting sort of data problems here. So one of the problems that we experience with trucking companies, for instance, is, let's say we identify a trucking company that's an imminent hazard to public safety and take them out of service. That company might reapply for a new DOT number with a change in their officers, like who runs the company, and try to go ahead and get reauthorized to operate. We need to detect that kind of fraud and prevent it from happening. We do regulatory inspections and enforcement actions. So we track, when we do inspections and we find violations and we issue civil penalties, we have that data, we release it out there so that people know who's a bad actor in the system. And we collect data about safety-related incidents. So we know where all the train incidents are, all the fatal crashes. We have a sample of other crashes. The NTSB actually gets all the aviation information. NASA collects voluntary reporting about aviation for us, so that it's separated. And that's a safety culture thing. So people are not necessarily willing to report a near miss to the people who regulate them, right? But somebody who has a research mission, like NASA, is a safe place to report that. And so we work together across government to get these kinds of data put together so that we can keep the transportation system safe. This is an important thing to think about as we go forward. So what do we have? What's out there? I can tell you where the airports are, where the roads are, where the bridges are, where the railroads are, where the pipelines are, kinda, and where all of the crossings between railroads and roadways are. Pipelines, I can't tell you exactly where they are. It's critical infrastructure. Homeland Security Directive, blah, 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 says don't share that. So we don't. But we have a fuzzy location for where the pipelines are. This is what it looks like. They're all in the Gulf. So this is all open. You can get this, you can analyze it. Go ahead.
2 questions. One, are you taking questions during your talk?
Come on.
Okay. Why does Department of Transportation, why are they concerned with pipelines?
Pipelines transport hazardous materials like oil, gases, and some liquefied gases as well.
So it's because they're transporting?
Because they're transporting them.
Then why not power lines?
Electricity delivery is different. That's all I'm going to go with. Anybody here from the Department of Energy? Want to answer that? Probably because Congress said energy should figure it out. I don't have a good answer to that. That's one of those weird places, right? Like who should be responsible for pipelines? Because really pipelines generally transport, at least from an interstate perspective, energy products, right? So should Department of Energy be in charge of them, or should we? We kind of share a responsibility. We work it out together.
Do you set the standards of safety for that, or do you contribute to those standards?
The Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration sets standards, yes, for pipeline safety, for what constitutes a reportable incident when there's a leak or a safety-related condition, or when there is an actual explosion. They also prescribe the standards for the containers that move hazardous materials across all modes of transportation. So they'll give an endorsement to an individual to ship hazardous materials, and they prescribe like what the tank car regulation is, or what the packing standard is.
You're the guys responsible for grading the bridges as well?
We are. And we're making that data better, because right now we get 1 score for the entire bridge. We're breaking that up into 3 scores. Michael, help me out. No? Multiple scores? We just said we're going to do this, but there's a rulemaking on the street. So we're going to try to get 1 for the substructure, for the actual superstructure, and a couple of other bits and pieces about the bridge to sort of break that out.
How often you can do the data?
We release the bridge data annually, and every bridge is inspected every 3 years. So about 1/3 of the bridges are inspected every year. Okay. We get volume data. There's like 4,000 traffic monitoring stations around the country. There's a map of those too. And we can identify, some of those can identify whether there's cars driving over them or trucks driving over them. They're called weigh-in-motion stations. So we can identify freight volumes. We work with our friends at the census to understand commodity flows. So we understand how stuff is moving across the nation. This clogged artery picture is how clogged our freight system will be in 2040 if we don't do something. We have transit volumes, and it's not necessarily like this is how many people ride the bus on this line on this day. What we do have is what we call passenger miles traveled or vehicle revenue miles traveled, so that we can understand how transit agencies are actually operating their vehicles. We also have how many planes are moving, and how many people are on those planes. We have summary statistics and origin and destination statistics. Sometimes we have ticket level data so you can understand prices. That's where a lot of these cool things come from, and other places. We also do lots of surveys and nationally representative samples on travel habits and behaviors. There's a National Household Travel Survey. There's an American, and there's other related surveys that are out there at Census and Labor that are also interesting to how people use their time to travel.
When you say origin destination, do you mean of air traffic, of air passengers?
Yeah, airport to airport, yeah.
Okay.
We know where all the roads are. We didn't used to know where all the roads are. We only knew where the highways were, or what constituted a highway by regulation. Then we said, hey, maybe we should just go ahead and ask the states, hey, can we just have all your road data? And they said, sure. So now we have the all roads network of linear reference data, which is awesome. And we know who owns it, what the condition of the pavement is. We can tell you how long it is, how many lanes are on it, some geometry, whether it's signalized. We could tell you whether it has a median, how wide the lanes are, and what the mile marker points are. And this is super useful, because sometimes I just get data that comes back without a latitude and a longitude, but I'll get mile marker 8. Well, that's a point over here on this line. And now that I have the linear reference data, I can actually put mile marker 8 on that curvy line, and I know where it's supposed to be. Wasn't able to do that before. This is open and available. The Get It link will get you there. We are going to release detailed traffic volume data. So right now you can get summary level data. It goes back to 1942, which is super interesting for somebody. We got it monthly from 1970 till now. But we'll give you underlying hourly volume data. So you'll get charts like this.
Hey, I don't mean to interrupt, guys. If you're tweeting, could you tweet at Data Innovation so I can tweet you guys?
Josh would like some credit.
Social media presence.
Yes. So I don't have a timing on this yet. We're working on it still. But there's not a lot of privacy sensitive stuff. It's more the size that we need to deal with. and we're trying to figure out how to deal with that.
Is,
Go
is
ahead.
that going to be released like with sort of in commercial intent, in commercial intent inspired, or more for research purposes?
I mean, it probably could be used for both.
Like the Googles of the world sort of taking that and using it to adjust their
They could
algorithms
probably use it to calibrate models. So you'll get traffic volume essentially, not necessarily speed, and you'll get to see how many trucks are moving around and that kind of stuff, which could tell you whether or not there's economic changes that are happening, right? So if you've ever heard like Micheline Casey from the Federal Reserve Board talk, she talks about trying to sense what's moving in the economy, right? And freight and traffic indicators are generally indicators of some sort of activity, generally economic. So being able to sense changes in the flows of vehicles might help you predict changes in economic conditions.
What's the granularity of this data?
I don't know. I don't know yet. So I told you about freight and passenger models. So we have origin and destination. Yes,
When you say freight, do you mean rail freight or truck or?
all freight.
What?
Rail, truck, waterway, airports, you name it. And so we've got data on tonnage value and commodity. It's not necessarily by like warehouse to warehouse. It's sort of aggregated geographies. It's a little funky, but it's the best that we have right now. We do a 2007 base year that's consistent with the commodity flow survey at the census. We snap all of that to a network. So we distribute that flow across water, rail, highway, and airport, and then scale it based on what we know on a bunch of econometric factors. And we go ahead and predict how clogged our highways and waterways are going to be in 2040. And we said, gosh golly gee willikers, shouldn't we try to figure this out for the way people move? So we have a new beta traveler analysis framework, just released, I want to say July. And that estimates across auto, bus, air, and rail, person trips by county, or equivalent, because like in Virginia, sometimes you have Alexandria City, and sometimes you have Arlington County, right? And you get 2008 as your base year, and we'll scale that up to using a bunch of econometric stuff to 2040. That data is out there and available. The model's documented. You can check it out. Tell us what you think. If you love flight data, September 22nd to the 24th, there is a workshop to play with flight data. So who uses FlightAware to check where their flights are, or any of these other sites? It's all coming from this thing called SWIM. So if you want to use SWIM data and figure out what it is, you can check out this workshop. I mentioned safety data. I know some, but not everything. I'm required by law to have a census of fatal roadway crashes. I know what happens at the places where railroads and highways touch, and whether there are crashes, whether or not they were fatal. I know about railroad trespasser casualties, a good chunk of which are unfortunately suicides. I know about large truck crashes. I have summary level data about transit incidents, which is a big deal here in WMATA, right? So I know about employee injuries at railroads and at transit, as well as passenger or other kinds of injuries. I know about pipeline incidents. ProPublica, for those of you who like journalists, has a pipeline incident tracker. It's a pretty cool little thing. It's cooler than whatever we put out. We track hazardous material spills, environmental consequences, and property damage associated with these things too. This is one of those places where we want to talk a little bit about how we can use data science, and I'll get to this point a little bit later. But we have to add a lot of context back to this data to try to get predictive, and that's a place where we'll talk about how I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're trying to do. All that safety data is open. All this stuff was happening long before I got here. Just thought I'd share, like, I didn't make all this happen, right? Like, chief data officer didn't magic a bunch of data out the door. We've been releasing this data as a department for a real long time. A lot of what I'm working on is trying to come up with new and better ways to release that. Some of this data, you have to go download a SAS file for every year, going back to 1970, unpack that into something that makes sense, glom that all back together and make, like some sort of time series on your own. Or if you wanted to study Alabama across time, you'd have to download all these national files, filter out Alabama, and then smack that all together. That kind of sucks. So we want to fix that experience.
Two questions about data. First, what sort of provenance do you have along with the data?
Be more specific.
Well, if I'm going to get pipeline into the data and I start looking at it, how do I know what the units of measure are? How do I know who generated it? That sort of thing. That's what I mean in terms of provenance.
So we try to go ahead and give as much documentation as possible. Almost all of this stuff, for better or for worse, is based on some form that we created. So a regulation tells the industry what to report and to fill out form 8500.2. And then there's a whole instruction manual for what all those fields are. And that's part of what we release with the data.
So I think you answered my next question, which is whether DOT provides specifications for the reported data.
To the extent that we can, yes.
So do you influence any sort of, I would say, certainly national, but international standards in terms of reporting data? For instance, there's a movement under something that's city data, where they're trying to provide some coherence for reporting all sorts of things, statistics that cities have in terms of their data, so that you can compare things in a reasonable fashion without spending hours and hundreds of hours trying to massage or normalize the data for comparison.
We've got lots of standards. They're not necessarily followed. Right? I mean, or we get standards like, my favorite, like Matt, you can talk more about this than I can. Like we get a de facto standard like GTFS for transit, which is really loosely defined. It's kind of willy-nilly. And so what you get is the best available data that somebody give you. So,
May I have a follow-on question? Is DOT, do they have any initiatives to try and introduce ontologies into the mix?
no.
Okay.
There was one in the back first.
Guys, in general, can you say your name and I guess where you're coming from before your question too, just so we all get to know each other? Thanks.
I'm Bob. I'm coming from Institute for Personalities. Just a very general question. I see there's so many links with lots of data on these slides, and everybody's snapping pictures of them. Are you willing to share this slide deck on the meetup sites?
Yep, Josh has it. You can post it to the meetup site.
Blue?
That's easy.
Hey, I'm Krishna. I'm from DOJ as a contractor.
Okay.
So, is that a standard format, right? Like text format, CSV, or different, any kind of standardization around this data?
No.
Okay.
No. And that's partly because there are a lot of people who have been releasing some of this stuff for a real long time. I can tell you that, our good friends over here with the roadway crashes have been releasing the same data set since 1970, right? So they've improved it over time, right? But now it's all in SAS and DVF, right? And so they're kind of like, I know how to do this. Don't make me change that yet, right? The bridge inventory has been released the same way since 1980. So we could do better, and we will, but we have to allocate resources and help people sort of get new processes put into place, right? And that's kind of what I'm in charge of. But we have every potential release practice under the sun, guaranteed. So some things are CSV, some are fixed with text files still. There's a lot that we could be doing better. We are working on some APIs. Our good friends at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, who have some of our regulatory data, they have just built an API for all of their licensing and insurance and safety related information. They released that API February or March-ish, and it's already got 20 million API calls. So it's kind of an important data set, I would guess. So we understand the value of doing this, and the more we do, the more stories we can tell. Okay. When we do enforcement is a lot of things. So we issue civil penalties when somebody has a violation. All that civil penalty data is out there and available. Recalls, I asked about recalls. We're in the middle of the largest recall in United States history, and open data is going to be a big part of how we're going to try to get people information about whether or not they're affected, right? So there are 250 million cars registered in the United States. The Takata airbag recall impacts 34 million vehicles. We have to get 34 million people to get their car fixed. They're not
How
coming.
many of us are in that 34 million?
Yeah. They're not coming to safercar.gov to get this information. Many of them don't even know that safercar.gov exists. We know that part of what we need to do is to get this data out and liquid so that it can be put in as many hands as possible. Because we cannot control the information being. And in terms of consumer protection, fluidity of data is key to achieving our mission. Recall compliance is generally very low, and it's specifically very low on vehicle stuff because there's a lot, right? And I think people are kind of suffering from recall fatigue. Every week now, right? You've heard a news story, another 1 million cars over here, right? How do we change the game of making people continue to chase recall information, right? These are questions we think about. We also have textual complaint data. Everybody loves the CFPB's complaint data. We were doing complaint data before it was cool. So when people complain about broken stuff in their cars, they call us, email us, fax us. Yes, they fax us. And we have what we call a vehicle owner questionnaire, and people fill out a bunch of information and a narrative about what's broken on their cars. We use this to identify potential risks in the current vehicle fleet and launch a defect investigation. We also do drug and alcohol screening on a lot of the transportation workforce.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
I know what some of those acronyms are, but what if all of them know? If you could?
Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Railroad Administration, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, so that's trucks, buses, limos. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, so that's your automobiles, your standards, your 5-star safety ratings, your recalls, and all that good stuff. As well as Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, so turn signals need to be this bright and placed on this space, and they have to have this much area and all that kind of stuff. That's stuff that we write regulations for as well. And the last one is the Pipeline and Hazmat Safety Administration. Data, data, data. All out there. Again, all right, I'm going to be honest with you. So the FAA Civil Penalties isn't really data. It's a PDF to Excel file. We're working on it. Promise, but it's there. It's out there. And you can do something with it. We track our revenue and investment. We are currently putting a wonderful thing out on our websites about how the Highway Trust Fund is going broke, and Congress continues to not fund the Highway Trust Fund and transportation. So we track how we're doing. There's a bunch of different trust funds that fund transportation, and we also get direct appropriations. So we have an Airport and Airway Trust Fund, which, aptly named, funds airport stuff. We have a Highway Trust Fund, which funds roads across the country, as well as a variety of our safety and enforcement programs. There's also an Inland Waterways Trust Fund, which isn't Department of Transportation's, but a portion of that goes to St. Lawrence Seaway for some of the port stuff that they do. Inland waterways actually are really weird. So the marine transportation system has like 30 federal agencies involved in it. It's pretty awesome. So you got NOAA for water levels and all this good stuff. You got the Army Corps for locks. You got the Coast Guard for enforcement. Like, there's a bunch of people involved. USDA monitors grain transportation and only grain transportation. Energy monitors energy products that are floating on the water. It's really, it's a fascinating kind of like, who in the government's in charge of this today? We also track our projects and our investments for airport, highways, and transit as well. Some of you want to know about big data. You can have big data. We have the Intelligent Transportation Research Program. So any pilot across the country that we have funded must deposit the live data in our research repository. You can get any of the data from vehicle awareness devices. If you'd like to see how the communication networks perform and you're interested in packet capture data, have at it. You can have contextual data, roadway, traffic, weather, and all that good stuff too. It's all shared on our Research Data Exchange. So if you're really interested in tinkering with sort of the future of transportation and data, to see how big it is and how we're working, this is the place to go. Adding to it every few months. My favorite still is our pavement research. So whoever has passed a sign that says road test, right? That's us. That stretch of road is part of our long-term pavement performance program. So when you put a big old ditch in the ground and fill it with gravel and subgrade and you put some asphalt on top of it, you want to know how long it's going to last. You want to know about how the environment is affecting it. You want to know which different kinds of mixes perform better in what kinds of traffic conditions and weather conditions. You want to make good choices, because if you make a bad choice, you create a maintenance nightmare and stuff gets too expensive to actually maintain. And then there's a bunch of potholes and cracking and everybody's angry at you. So we have studied, since 1987, 2,500 sections at various stages across the country to understand their pavement performance characteristics. It's fascinating stuff, if you like pavement. It's free and available too. We work with a contractor to get that data out the door.
Is there something special going on in Chicago? There always seems to be.
Well, there's only 2 seasons. I grew up there, right? You know, there's winter and construction. Right? So my parents were just in town, and they said, please don't come home because we don't want to drive anywhere. We'll come visit you. I guess the Jane Byrne interchange downtown is an absolute nightmare. You can't, like the 290 that goes under the old post office. So it's a real sad place right now. It's not a good time. Take transit is my answer. Or walk and bike, which will make Michael happy. Yeah.
What kind of response and questions do you get from the states? Are they partners? Do they really consider themselves partners and look for solutions to the problems? Or can you share anything on that?
So I think there's a bunch of different ways that we work on this stuff. I think in general, you know, the states are good partners in sharing the data and trying to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars, right? They're interested in spending their federal share as well as whatever they collect directly from all of their constituents well. There is an association of state highway transportation officials called AASHTO, and they've been around since before there was a Department of Transportation. They were working on roadway standards and making sure that like roads joined up at state borders and that kind of stuff, and that signage was kind of consistent across states, because that was like a good idea for commerce and safety. They've been doing that for a while. And they're good partners in this. I think we work with those guys a lot. There's a couple of other associations as well. So there's the Association of Traffic Safety Information Professionals, who is kind of the big data quality advocate for all of our crash data. And you gotta remember that a traffic crash it actually involves a lot of different people, right? So a crash starts with a 911 call, right? Goes to a public safety answering point. And then there's some dispatch of police who fill out a police accident report, right? And hopefully they get all that stuff right. And then there might be some toxicology on the scene, right? Or an alcohol test on the scene. And so that might then result in some sort of court adjudication and some hospitalization, right? So think of all of these different domains that are involved in just understanding what happened in a crash. And none of them are a transportation department, right? But that data is important to us because we want to engineer roads a certain way to make those crashes not happen. And so those traffic safety information professionals are working across boundaries and with transportation engineers to understand the data that we need to understand how that road impacts safety. Yeah?
How much is, so you reference those different domains, right? That's kind of interesting. Is there like, I would hope there would be some sort of way, some sort of interoperability, some sort of common case reference number so you could get the information that is supposed to be available to actually look at patterns?
Every state is a snowflake. And every police department on top of that is a snowflake.
Okay.
I heard a story the other day about, this was last year, I went to go to Traffic Records Forum where all of the traffic safety people nerd out for a couple of days.
Okay.
There is a jurisdiction in Vermont where the police chief just will not use the electronic system. You'll get the faxed report and you'll like it. That's just the way it's going to be. You can't tell, like I can't from a Department of Transportation tell a policeman how to do his job, right? So what we do instead is work through some of our standards, So there are some ANSI standards for crash information. And then what we have is called the Model Minimum Uniform Crash Criteria, or the MUC. And we worked with the states to try to understand, common ways to gather and share crash data. But for instance, like Florida doesn't care about blowing snow, but Minneapolis cares about all different kinds of snow. Was it a blizzard? Was it blowing? Was it still? Was it frozen? They care about all these different kinds of things. And so, like, a police accident report nationwide will not be uniform. And that's by design. Because there might be different weather conditions that people are interested in, or lighting conditions that people are interested in, that are jurisdiction specific. We do our best to sort of apply a veneer on top of it for our own sort of data standardization things, and we work on harmonization, and we're going to continue to do that.
So you hit on sort of you've hit on both the data that you're putting out as a department, which has been fascinating, and you're starting to talk a little bit about your ingest process from locals and states. What type of data would you like to have at the DOT that you're not getting right now, or not getting in a high quality way? Or is there data that would also be handy to have, like, reported in from citizens? Like, what would you like to have that you don't have in your data toolbox?
You have to ask the hardest question of the night. Can I table that for a second?
Sure.
There's a lot of different things that I think we would like. So, we have a really hard time understanding exposure for bicyclists and pedestrians. We don't know how much walking and biking is happening. It's a very localized phenomenon. And so, like, we cannot calculate, like, sort of the rate of pedestrian fatalities, because we don't know how many people walking miles there are, right? There's interesting crowdsourcing projects out there. There's lots of different ways for us to try to understand walking behaviors. They're still going to be very sampled in crowdsourcing, and we have to understand what we can and cannot get out of them, right? But things that we talk about are things like all of the personal fitness apps. A lot of the bike associations also put out their own sort of bike counters. Bike Share has a bunch of data about travel patterns as well. We'd love to see more of that be open so that anybody could put that to work. We'd love to see every transit agency have their routes, stops, and schedules published in some sort of standard format with intellectual property terms that are fair. That does not exist yet. I think there's a lot of opportunities out there for our state and locals to practice a little bit more openness. I think there's also a lot of barriers. So every state, again, is a snowflake and has different liability laws. So some states are hesitant to publish certain kinds of safety information for fear of being sued. So there's a more broad conversation about how to safely and effectively release that information in a responsible way that doesn't create an exposure that is unwarranted. For some of those states who have much more biased, if you will, I don't want to use that word, but I'm on the spot, so much different liability laws. We'll go with that.
I'll edit that out of the video.
Yeah. Go ahead.
One follow-up question. So similar to how with your federal grants, where data had to be public off of the reports coming back and the research coming back, has the department considered any rulemaking in its transportation granting that would place anything conditional around data sharing? And is that legal for you to do? Or because I'm assuming you've looked into it already.
Well, the vast majority of our grants and money are formula grants that are dictated by Congress to go out a certain way. And so there's not much in the way of strings that we attach to those. Most of them, honestly, support like construction activity, and the building and maintenance of roads and bridges and airports and those kinds of things. Some of our discretionary programs certainly offer us some opportunities, but I think we need to be smart programmatically about how we do this. This is, again, one of those places where I think we have a chicken and egg problem. We've had MUC. We're on version 4 of MUC. There's a related data standard called the minimum inventory of roadway elements, or the model inventory of roadway elements, or MIRE. So when you put MUC and MIRE together, it's an interesting kind of thing. But we have standards, and we have grants for data improvement programs. It's really kind of up to the states for how they distribute those monies, and different people are involved in different places. So, you know, I don't have a straightforward answer to you. I don't think we'd do it through a rulemaking. I think we might if we did anything, we'd put strings in other kinds of places. It's easier to do in the research world. That's what the intelligent transportation system stuff is all research. And so advocating for data transparency and research is a more straightforward place than in the operation and maintenance of the transportation system. Yeah.
Some questions I meant to ask earlier. Is DOT doing anything or starting to do anything about autonomous vehicles?
Yes.
And if so, does any of that involve the amount of specifically sensor data that is envisioned to be needed for such vehicles?
So what we have is a proposal before Congress to fund an autonomous vehicles research program. And that's part of our Grow America Act proposal. You can check it out at transportation.gov/grow-america. And if we are funded, we might look at those things. Yep.
My name is Christian from Socrata. Are there any federal agencies that DOT is like particularly looking to follow in the footsteps of how they deliver and share data? Inspiration for you?
I don't think any one federal agency gets it right. I think we're all trying to figure out the right thing to do. I can tell you whose data we want to use more of. I mean, everybody wants census data, right? So a lot of what I talk about, I can get through some of these too. Airline performance and maps. Let's go to the so what. So these are the questions that we're kind of scratching our heads on right now. And some of it's, we're good at the retrospective analysis, and we are not so great at the prospective analysis. And being able to bring in economic and ethnographic and other demographic indicators into the context in which all of these transportation incidents and construction activities are happening is a key piece to being able to get to a place that's more predictive. And we're not in that place right now. It's the same thing with weather data, which is not optimally released either because it's so big. But how do we get a place where I can make that much more usable, not only to me, but other places in government? I'm interested in labor data. I'm interested in where the Energy Information Administration is seeing more mining activity, because mining activity brings trucks, and trucks bring traffic and deteriorate pavement. And then once the stuff leaves the mine, it goes on a rail car, right? And then it explodes somewhere in West Virginia. Sometimes, right? It sucks. But we need to, that's a really complicated system. And there's lots of different places. If you take a mine, right? Let's think about all the federal agencies that have data about that mine. Energy Information Administration tracks information about what's in that mine and what its output is. The Department of Labor has the Mine Safety and Health Administration, so they know about the mine address of record, who owns it, how many people are employed there, how many people have been hurt there, how many inspections they've done. And that little rail spur, once it leaves the mine's boundary, its geographic boundary, it becomes the Federal Railroad Administration's responsibility. But anything that happens inside the mine's boundary is MSHA's responsibility. Awesome. We got to talk to each other. I've got data about all of the trucks and the carriers that might be serving that mine, all the railroads that serve that mine. How do I put that together into a way to assess the potential risk, or the change in risk, the change in flow, to identify whether I need to allocate inspector resources or provide technical assistance to that state to make sure the roads stay in a state of good repair? or make an investment? Those are the kinds of questions that we're struggling with right now. Yeah.
I'll just add a point that while we're talking about federal data, the states, we have 52, federal highways, there's about 52 different states and then some Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. There are about 409 metropolitan planning organizations that we deal with. All of those are reporting data to federal highways. And if you throw in transit, there are thousands of transit agencies reporting data.
It's about 1,800.
About 1,800, okay. So one of the things to keep in mind is a lot of what happens at the federal level, by the time we're able to actually implement some type of policy practices and how we handle data, it has already been happening at a state or a local level for a long time. So whatever you're seeing at the federal level, and things that you're asking for as far as data integration, if you look at, say, you look at the state of Maryland, Maryland is farther along than the federal government is in how it's handling this data. So one of the things that you may want to look at when you're looking at open data and how to get your hands on some transportation data that's a little more granular is to look at the states, because that's what we are doing. We actually refer to the states and the MPOs as our partners because they are actively involved in helping us figure out how to actually use that at the national level. And so sometimes a lot of the granular data is not going to make it up to the national level because when you're trying to do national policy, you don't need a lot of that data because you're aggregated, you have an aggregated picture. So it's very important to not lose the sight that we are a country made up of different actors and different partners who are all trying to send data up to the federal level, but they're also
Doing their own job.
Doing so much on the ground with their own data.
That is Michael Nesbitt, Federal Highway Administration.
None of those
Saving my
comments
ass.
are endorsed by the
So I
federal.
appreciate it.
They are my own.
So, but these are, this gets to sort of the data science-y kinds of questions and all the big data stuff, right? I don't have a velocity problem at the federal level, right? To Michael's point, the velocity problem is at the state or the local or at the transit agency level. I have a variety problem that I want to deal with. I have what I call slow fat data. It comes in annually or monthly or daily sometimes if I'm real lucky, right? And we set that reporting pattern by regulation, right? And sometimes we just do silly things. But what that does is it sort of limits our ability to have some agility to what's going on. At the same time, the transportation infrastructure doesn't change that much that fast. Go ahead. You wanted?
I'm going to disagree with you there.
Go ahead.
One great example. What is the DOT going to do? Sorry, Matt K. with Transit Screen. What's the DOT going to do about Uber? Uber is about 5 years old at this point, maybe 6. They are taking about 45% of the total taxi hired call, rides in the country. They're national. They're international, actually. And so what you had before was a city by city taxi fleet problem is suddenly a national transportation planning issue. So that's a massive change. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts
That's
are.
travel, not infrastructure.
Right.
I was talking about infrastructure first.
But
travel changes much more quickly.
right, but
So-
transit, is, buses are they infrastructure? Are they, that's their travel, at the same time, and so right, I get it, but still, this is massive changes in the transportation system only over the last 5 years, and love to hear if DOT is thinking about this kind of thing.
Somebody, not me.
Okay.
I do know there are a lot of really interesting data sharing agreements going on between cities, urban planners, and Department of Transportation with, like, LA has a partnership with Waze, Boston has a partnership with Uber. I don't know if that would address that concern or not, but they are paying
It
attention.
doesn't.
Okay.
It's
So-
this fall.
It doesn't. And so metropolitan planners, let's be honest, so the people who have the greatest need for data are metropolitan planning organizations who are making their long-term plans and their short-term plans for how to invest in a region, right? So they're trained in school to chunk census data and transportation data and travel survey data. And if anybody has ever asked you to fill out a survey about where you're going and what you did, fill that thing out because metropolitan planners need it to figure out what's going on. Their data integration problems are the data's old, the data's not documented. The data is from a variety of sources. So Uber or Waze offers this interesting opportunity to an MPO to say, hey, I can better understand people's travel habits without conducting a survey. except no, because it's not everybody. It doesn't actually cover your whole city. And you need to figure out how you address the bias in that data and understand what's really happening. The best place that we're thinking about that kind of stuff is through Travel Model Improvement Program. But in terms of like what to do about Uber, I don't even know what the federal role would be.
Collect the transportation planning data you need.
What's the problem that you see?
The problem is that and other people like Kevin Webb can talk more, from Cavill can talk more articulately about this, but they provide no transportation planning data whatsoever. They're extremely resistant to sharing data with anyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, MPOs are about to lose sight of all of these all these trips they're taking, at the last mile. Previously, they were able to get those from more buses, from paratransit, whatever. Those are all going to disappear, and there's going to be a big gap in the data. And those things are also growing in terms of number of rides being taken. So this is an important, a sort of paradigmatic change in some ways in mobility. And it seems like, that data is there's going to be a huge gap because no one's collecting it and no one's addressing the problem.
Fair enough.
Just like that.
Yeah.
You mentioned GTFS before.
Mm-hmm.
Who should have a role in setting that? I know it's probably an international standard, perhaps.
So standard is a really weird word for GTFS.
Specification.
It's a de facto thing, right? We tried a standard once before, nobody adopted it, so that didn't work out so well. And I won't name names or people, but there was a standard before there was GTFS, and it was not on the uptake. I think the federal role there is really in the sponsorship of that. We've had really intense internal debates about whether we even have a statutory authority around GTFS. So we're supposed to monitor how transit functions from a financial perspective or from an asset management perspective. So if you look at the National Transit Database, you can find out about revenues and passengers and load factors and all that kind of stuff in aggregate for every transit agency across every mode of transportation that transit has. Ferry, demand response, fixed route, all that good stuff. We don't actually have a statutory authority to understand where transit is, which is weird. But there's ways around this, right? I think the federal role is really to encourage the transparency and the fluidity of that information, to understand that it's important for mobility and really for helping people understand how to get around their cities. And we can advocate for it, and we can let people know when it's an eligible expense to develop it. And we can try to pursue that kind of data fluidity as sort of a foundational piece of a 21st century transportation system. But that's really about where it stops, at least right now with our current legislative authorities.
Support and maybe invest in, I guess.
Sometimes at best, yeah.
We got time for one more question.
Yeah. All right. No.
Rather than try to aggregate all this data from a department standpoint, right? Which of your modes, highway, transit, rail, are closest in standing up a pilot to do something with the data they've already collected? Translated into risk analysis, predictive analytics, whatever.
Nobody's quite there yet. I think we're still in the conversations about how we would want to go about it. But I don't think we're in the pilot stage quite yet. I think we're still trying to work on our own internal data fluidity issues and really what an analysis framework needs to look like. What is a good, passionate question to ask of our data that we're not yet asking? And I think we're working on that still. Okay.
Great.
How'd I do?
That was great. So I will be putting these online sometime the next week, probably around the same time as I post the video. Daniel had the honor of, just a couple hours ago, the RSV count broke the highest we ever had. We had like 102 RSVPs. So congratulations.
And all those people that didn't show up,
They
they don't get the
out.
slides. They don't get the slides.
That's the data.
Uh-huh.
So again, as you leave, feel free, please take all that food, it'll just go to waste otherwise. Leave a business card and I can send you friendly emails about data. Tell your friends if you like this, if you know other people in federal agencies, or state or local. I think one of the next ones we want to do is a DC open data one, kind of get some more boots on the ground from people. So tell, if you know people, tell me. And then if you are a private sector person at this event and you thought this was as great as I think it is, and you're interested in sponsoring the future of these meetups, we can do bigger promotion, you can get more food, maybe do beer and wine, and you get the chance to talk as well. Feel free to come up to me afterwards. So thank you so much for coming. I'm not kicking you out, but we can't stay here for too much longer, so feel free to chat a little bit longer. So thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it.